Good morning. I'm going to try and give a small commentary on chapter or lecture 21 of the Foundations of Esotericism. It's taken me quite some time to prepare this because it's a large chapter. It's a very central theme where a couple of complications come up in that the stenography of these lectures is quite small or quite, not as complete as later lectures. Therefore, the ideas are in short sentences and quite aphoristic, and we have to build the connections. And so the commentary on this chapter will be trying to actually just get the threads of thinking in this lecture aligned so that we can follow the thoughts. Again, it's as always one of those lectures where you need to reread it after listening to this, because I'm not even convinced that I've got all the thoughts as clear as I should have, because they are quite convoluted. And as we've seen in these Foundations of Esotericism, Steiner keeps building upon this threefold principle of form, life, and consciousness in relationship then to the evolution of the human soul, and especially the evolution of the etheric, the physical, the etheric, and the astral bodies as the vessel for the higher self or the ego of the human being. With that, of course, we have the work to be done, and in this lecture I've titled it, or Steiner himself titles it in the first sentence, the techniques of reincarnation. So what are the techniques that we can understand out of form, life, and consciousness, the relationship to the plant, the animal, and the mineral world, how what we think, say, and do is also a theme that is brought together. So in this particular lecture, all these threefoldness, especially those three, what we think, say, and do, actually we should probably say, to get the sequence correct, what we do, say, and think, the mineral, the plant, and the animal world, form, life, and consciousness have to do with our karma and our reincarnation. So quite a complex set of things, but it's a really strong lecture where our agency in the future of the created world, the future of our karma, can be taken into account in the ennoblement of our thoughts, our feelings, and our willing. So we could say that our doing, what we say, has a lot to do with our feeling, and then of course our consciousness has a lot to do with what we think. But in this sense, he gives us the idea that our actions have an effect upon the highest spiritual worlds, the higher Devachan, and that in that respect, everything that we do has an effect upon the mineral world. And here maybe a parenthesis or a small comment in between is that when we're looking at the techniques of karma and reincarnation from the point of view what we say, what we do, say, and think in the world, has a lot to do with our current situation in the world, where we are meeting, so to say, the consequences of irresponsibility of the human soul to take a schooling or an ennoblement of our actions, of our words, and of our thinking. So we meet in climate change, the effects upon the mineral world. We meet in viruses, the effects upon the animal world. And of course, we sort of don't like to think on these terms. This is possibly an old spiritual scientific concept we think is sort of medieval. But it is a reality, and there are people who are talking in the world now how we are responsible for the climate change, how the pandemic is a result of our not looking after sanctuaries for the animals, not looking after the forest, not looking after the mineral world in a correct way, and therefore the results of that are that we have to wear and live through the consequences of that. And in this particular lecture, Steiner is really asking us to learn to refine our actions, because our actions have an effect upwards into the astral world and an effect upon the mineral world and the forms of the future. And in that sense also our speaking and our feeling life have an effect into the plant world. Now some of these we can't perceive yet, and I do believe that, for example, we will start to at some point begin to understand that we not only need animal rights, but we also need plant rights and environmental rights, because we will start to perceive, just as we can start now to perceive the pain of our eating of meat, we will also start to see the results of our speaking and our doing upon the plant world and the mineral world. And I think the climate change and the situations that we're living in now are a strong mirror to us, which of course we don't particularly want to embrace, because as Steiner says in this particular lecture, I think this is really the strongest comment, is that we think with our emotions and we think with our prejudices and our desires. We're not prepared to go to the point of training our thinking to be more objective beyond our desire and our thinking. So we could say that our greed, our desire, our emotional bodies are far more comfortable than actually working our way through to a higher thinking. And he does give a key that I think is quite important in our time. He talks about how painful it is for people to learn mathematics if they're not prepared to give up their desire in their thinking. And, you know, again, another cultural comment on the world of technology is, especially say in young people before they leave school, that how are we still prepared to learn to write and to learn mathematics? So when we learn to write, especially in the Western cultures, in other cultures it's different, but how do we learn to write from left to right and do mathematics from right to left on a written page, where we train our thinking through grammar and we train our thinking through the principles of arithmetic to become much more objective and in charge of the objective thinking, and to be able to raise the consequences of our thinking into a much more objective thing. And if we don't do that, we will at some point reap the consequences of our thinking in this sense of our consciousness. Steiner talks about the consequences of that upon the animal world. And we can see the results of that. We can see the results in the world in climate change and in the pandemics, which is the way that karma comes back to us in dealing with our effect upon the animal world. And now an interesting differentiation takes place in this lecture, where he says that the effects of our actions and of our speaking, so the will and the feeling world, rise upwards into the higher spiritual worlds, and therefore we can follow the consequences of our doing and our saying up into the spiritual world. But that the effects of our thinking, especially if we've attained to a thinking that isn't driven by our desires and our opinions, just our opinions, can work downwards towards the earth, so that a sort of a purified and ennobled thought world can actually then work downwards towards our next incarnation. So that is a way that we could also read, I suppose, sacred scriptures, the philosophies of different religions, the philosophies of different spiritual directives to cultures, is that we can see that many of these directives, some preserved in sacred texts, not only the Bible, but in the Quran and in other sacred scriptures, the Upanishads, the Vedas, the Tibetan and Egyptian texts, they are all can be read from this lens, that the human being is being asked in our cultural life to move from the chaos that the human soul is born into, and especially through the adolescent years, to go through a cultural ennoblement. The first might purely be at a physical level, but then later on we can go through a second cultural ennoblement, which is that of not just learning how to have good manners with each other, but also how to ennoble the soul for the service of humanity. And then a third ennoblement can take place, which is then how we can allow our virtues that we have developed in the ennoblement of the soul faculties to become part of the techniques of karma. So this is what this lecture is about, the techniques of karma. And he then says that when we look at a human being at the end of the lecture, I'm just going to look away to get the end of the lecture, he talks about how these ennoblements work towards what we bring with us in our next life. And he says the thought, the purer and more supersensible the thought, the more one works creatively upon one's character. So the work that we can ennoble our thought to go away from just our pure desires and our opinions, we create a more virtuous character. And our destiny is formed by our feelings, and our actions fashion the form. So he talks about the manifestations and the forces of actions. The forces of actions come out of the astral world but affect the physical plane. Our feelings, and that's the form within which we live, and the feelings create the opportunities of our destiny. So it's quite interesting that what we feel now towards things, if they are just driven by our desires and our opinions and our sense of comfort and egotism, the opportunities that come to us firstly in this life, but also then in a future karmic life, are also formed out of that. So I shouldn't say this, but possibly it could be quite a selfish thing to improve our sense of feeling and our thoughts and our actions, so that, you know, a better character and a better opportunity in our destiny, and then of course the opportunities and the character of our future destiny are formed through this ennoblement of especially our thinking and our feeling. But of course then the actions take place. So there's these two directions. There's the directions of the effects of our actions and our feelings, which rise into the spiritual world, but then the direction of our purified thinking, for want of a better word, or our ennobled thinking, move down backwards towards the earth and help us form the character of a future destiny, but also the opportunities that arise for us within our karma. So the techniques of karma is that we can have a deep effect upon the character and the opportunities of a future destiny, which of course are then only determined to the point of where the opportunity arises. We're not predestined to respond in a particular way to a particular opportunity. But of course, if our character is that of only being ennobled to the point of still being selfish or opinionated, we may respond to an opportunity that comes to us out of that and be unable to take a transformation of that opportunity into something more positive. And so the transformation of form, life, and consciousness is something that's really important for us to pay attention to. And I think, if I read this correctly, it's not only sort of saying, well, let's work on this so that future incarnations can be improved. Already now, if we discipline our thinking to go beyond thinking through our desire and our opinion, if we ennoble our feelings to go beyond the satisfaction of comfort, and if we ennoble the way we respond to opportunities, we can see that we participate in the ennoblement of the human soul. So yes, this lecture is quite complicated, but it is a synthesis of several themes that he's been building over the last 20 lectures into the techniques of karma. So after that, probably I'm hoping he's saying, oh, I better go and reread that lecture, because that's what I need to do. Have a good day, and I'll continue with the last 10 lectures in a few days. Cheers.